EVGA's new ICX cooler makes moves to directly measure VRAM and VRM component temperatures, which is a direct response to the thermal pad tumult that we exhaustively tested a few months ago at this point. The ICX cooler theoretically addresses the fact that GPU diode temperature is no longer the most important point of thermals on a video card, and that other components run hotter due to the now lower fan speeds as a result of the GPU-governed PWM. We had some parts custom made to validate individual component temperatures of ICX and ACX coolers, since EVGA makes big claims about each individual addition to the new ICX cooling block. For example, the aluminum fins, they call the pin fins, the backplate, and the holes in the heatsink itself. We validated these claims individually rather than just testing the cooler as a whole versus the old cooler, and have SC2 and FTW2 cards on the table. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by our Patreon supporters who help fund in-depth and unique testing like this. This type of depth and custom tooling is made easier by supporting at patreon.com/gamersnexus. EVGA's ICX and ACX cards will coexist with one another. They are gapped by about $30 in price. So there's a $30 price delta between ICX and ACX, and that extra cost is basically split between the addition of thermistors across the board and then the cooler overhaul alongside some other additions like 2 MCUs for processing the data from the thermistors, of course. The thermistors used are negative type. They are NTC thermistors, and that means that they respond to higher temperatures with lower resistance. That's how the temperature measurement is created in the various components that we're testing. So for these ICX cards, they've got placement near the VRM components, the memory components, and it's placed adjacent, not directly atop the casing for each of these devices. The thermistors are used to allow individual control of the second VRM fan. So that'd be the fan on the right, so the VRM temperature can be independent. It's no longer bound to GPU PWM signals, which is somewhat flawed at this point because GPUs have become power efficient enough that they don't require as high of a fan RPM to keep cool, but the VRMs are still burning. Because it's not feasible to place these thermistors directly below a BGA device like a VRAM module, EVGA places the thermistors close by, with some sensors landing on the backside of the PCB. We actually acquired some PCB diagrams that show the placement of each thermistor, shown on the screen now. The top side of the FTW2 PCB has 3 thermistors located near but not atop the VRAM modules. There are 4 more thermistors located topside for the power components. Coincidentally, EVGA is measuring the same power components we used in our huge EVGA VRM thermal benchmark a few months back, and that'd be MOSFET number 2, counting from the bottom up, MOSFET number 7, and MOSFET number 10, and they're also measuring the memory VRM temperature. We generally agree with EVGA's placement and specific positioning of the thermistors because number 2, the second from the bottom, that FET specifically gets a little warm because it is closest to the motherboard, so depending on the airflow and the case used, that can get pretty hot. It's flanked by 2 other power stages and phases on either side, so it's going to get warmer. The 7th one is in the middle of the board. It's going to be the warmest there because it's got components all around it. And then the 10th one we didn't really use in our testing, but EVGA's added it to their ICX cooler. This bottom side diagram shows the rest of the thermistor locations, one of which is an additional GPU diode backside measurement. The other is the 1-volt PLL minor rail, which is used for non-compute functions and can mostly be ignored. As for the component level analysis, this board is largely the same as the previous EVGA FTW1080 VRM. We previously worked with BuildZoid to analyze that board, and his analysis remains accurate. We'll put a link in the cards for that video. EVGA has switched one main thing for the VRM. Instead of using the NCP81382 FETs that they were using previously, they've now switched to Fairchild 3035 FETs. The previous FETs used on the FTW boards were rated for 35 amps continuous. The new ones are rated for 50 amps continuous and continues EVGA's way overkill design for the VRM on these cards. The NCP FET, if you recall our PCB analysis of that, is a combination of the high side, the low side, and the driver IC. So moving to Fairchild, really we're just getting a higher quality FET, the 3035 that's used. But in terms of your usability for overclocking, you probably won't see a huge difference. And the VRM truly is overkill. EVGA is still using a 5-phase that's doubled with the NCP81162 doublers that BuildZoid detailed in that VRM analysis. The same voltage controller is also used with the same 400 kHz PWM into the doubler, which then splits into 2 200 kHz signals for the phases. This means that your power quality is the same as a 5-phase, so the 10-phase design is almost entirely a marketing stunt and not really all that relevant to overclocking quality. That said, going for 10-phase does mean EVGA can spread the heat out over a wider area, which is probably the main thing they're going for here. As for the memory VRM, that's still the same on semi 4C805N high and low side FETs. If the thermistor and power design interests you further, please check the link in the description below for the full article where we've got a lot of depth on the ICX cooler and the ACX cooler. And that mostly covers the basics. There are a ton of small changes made to the cooler itself, like EVGA's newfound obsession with thermal pads. Wonder what triggered that. But we'll test each of those individually in the thermal benchmarking. For the record, those pads are rated at 1.2 watts per meter Kelvin. Before getting to the testing, to clarify a few things, the cards themselves, the SC2 and FTW2 cards, are largely the same as the ACX 3.0 versions. The only difference, again, that one FET change for the VRM is different, and then the cooler is different. The cooler, in addition to the thermistors, is really the only thing here that's the main focus point, because even the clock rate is the same. Between an FTW, which I have over here, and an FTW2, the clock rate is the same. So the only thing that you're going to see that'll cause any variance at all in FPS between these two devices is going to be GPU Boost 3.0, which is NVIDIA's boost functionality. There's different boost variants, one GPU to the next. So unless you had a massive sample size, you really can't firmly state that one is better than the other, and it doesn't matter anyway because the GPUs are going to boost to whatever clock rate they want, and performance other than that will remain the same. You might see one FPS variance. So we're not doing FPS benchmarking with these cards. There may be some in the article, but not in this video. We're focusing entirely on the things that matter here, which again is just going to be thermals for this benchmark. In terms of the ACX 3.0 cards, if you are an owner of SC or FTW, before getting to the test, you should know that you can upgrade for $100. We'll talk about whether or not that's actually worth it in the conclusion. That you should probably stick around for if you're thinking of upgrading. But the plan is basically $100 step up. You can send them your FTW or your SC, and then you get the equivalent ICX version back. Let's get into the testing. Our complete thermal testing methodology is defined in great detail in the article linked in the description below. This one is a really detailed article, so be sure to check it out if you don't normally. With regard to basic testing, we use logging software to monitor the NTCs on EVGA's ICX card, and we use our own calibrated thermocouples mounted to power components individually, which we can also use to further validate EVGA's own thermistor placement and accuracy. Our thermocouples use an adhesive pad that is 1/100th of an inch thick and does not interfere in any meaningful way with thermal transfer. The pad is a combination of polyamide and polymethylphenylsiloxane, and the thermocouple is a K-type hooked up to a logging meter. We also had a custom plate made to allow us to individually test the components of the ICX cooler as stated previously. Note that we are using the same SC2 card for these side-by-side ACX versus ICX comparisons. That is critical because the GPU for each test, again, can have some variance, and that's also why there's not much FPS difference between one to the next other than GPU boost. As for the FTW2 testing, we're comparing that against the straight ACX 3.0 FTW card, strictly because of the VRM issues we talked about previously, and we're using the same methodology for our VRAM and thermal pad torture testing that we used previously. Let's start with that one. This chart shows temperature versus time for our thermocouples that we mounted all over the ACX and ICX FTW cards. Yellow, orange, and red represent temperatures for the ACX cards. That'd be the warmer colors, not to do that intentionally, but warmer colors for those, and then maybe Andrew can highlight those on the screen. Green, teal, and blue, which is buried by the lighter blue, represent the ICX card. White represents the ambient temperature, which is a modifier that we applied to equalize room temperature as it relates to performance. That is done by collecting ambient for each test pass. Note that getting these numbers is only possible using our trusted thermocouple method that we've tested previously, since the ACX FTW did not have EVGA's new sensors. With our testing, we're seeing MOSFET number 7 and number 2 are mostly equal on the FTW2, represented by the blue colors, with both maxing out around 70 to 72.5 Celsius. Comparatively, the FTW ACX cooler posts FET number 7 and number 2 at around 76 to 79 Celsius, and that's a temperature improvement of between 4 and 9 C on the MOSFETs. The backside of the PCB also shows tremendous improvement, with the green line indicating we've now mostly achieved parity with the front side FET temperatures. This is largely attributable to the new backplate and reduced VRM temperatures overall, because those do bleed through the PCB, although it's not the most efficient transfer. Now we're moving into the SC2 ACX versus ICX comparison, which is where things get interesting. We're using our custom plates to test the performance on the same card and GPU. With a controlled fan speed of 1700 RPM on both fans, even the VRM fan, we're testing with combustors firm arc again to burn in power stages. We're also using EVGA's new thermistor readings. And first, we're looking at the difference of just the backplates. This first test was done using the ICX cooler in its entirety with only the backplate swapped. We ran this test specifically because EVGA suggested that the new backplate had a big impact on thermals. As shown here, the temperature difference is roughly within 1 Celsius for power 5, power 4, power 1, and memory 1, and also GN's MOSFET number 2 thermocouple, and even the GPU diode. We see a much larger difference in power 2 and memory 3, which is more of a factor of where those thermistors are located than anything. Let's look now at how the entire cooler performs versus ACX 3.0. Adding in those numbers with the same RPM between the coolers, we see that GPU temperature is effectively identical within usual test variants, and our thermocouple on FET number 2 shows an improvement of approximately 6 Celsius versus ACX. If we highlight power, you'll see that this holds true there as well. We're seeing several degrees improvement on the second FET, no matter how it's measured. The difference between these measurements is that EVGA is using a thermistor placed adjacent to the FET, while we're using a thermocouple mounted atop the FET casing. Neither is perfect. As for other temperatures, memory temps on the left side are down inconsequentially, with performance improving drastically as we approach the inductors and capacitor banks toward the right. That'd be memory number 3, which sees an improvement of about 14 Celsius in our testing. Just to throw in a comparative chart versus other vendors, this benchmark shows all cards set to their auto settings and adjusted for the delta T value that we measured during testing. EVGA's ICX FTW2 lands at around 48 Celsius delta T load, with almost 8 degrees Celsius delta T idle temperature. The latter temperature is seemingly high as a result of the idle fans when it's not actually doing anything. So of course you're gonna have a higher temperature idle. The former doesn't look impressive because EVGA has opted to allow for an acceptably warm GPU in exchange for improved noise levels, while leveraging their new independently controlled VRM fan to keep power under control. This is how the ICX card is meant to be used, and is why the GPU temperature is no longer the full story. Speaking of noise levels, let's take a look at those. With auto fan speed and stress testing workloads, we generally saw the FTW2 ICX cooler opting to run its GPU fan at 1900 RPM and VRM fan at 2100 RPM. With these configured, and with all passive cooling on the CPU, power supply, and everything else on the bench, we're seeing a noise output of 46.2 dBA. This is the only component in the system making noise. When we move to a fixed 1700 by 1700 fan speed, we're seeing a noise output of about 41.8, 1400 by 1600, which is where we were operating when averaged over low load gaming, puts us at 38.2 dBA, and 1700 by 1800 is where we operated during most gaming workloads of sort of AAA titles. That's what you should expect for the most part, and that configuration had us just over 42 dBA. We also have before and after VBios update numbers for the original ACX FTW card, which uses fans that are physically identical other than the MCU control. Those are on here as well. EVGA's decision to launch ICX at this point is a little interesting. Pascal's not new, and there are new cards theoretically around the corner. So why would they do it? Well, it's really just because they've got this big ACX thing looming over them. If you search for any of their cards on Google, you'll probably run into thermal testing, maybe our VRM testing, maybe their forums, and it's enough to cause concern for new buyers. Now, just to kind of recap what we said previously, with the updated VBios, which is not necessary if you have the thermal pads, and the thermal pads, the ACX cards are fine. They're well within operating temperature. The VRMs can handle a lot more temperature than the cards are putting out, especially with those updates. So if you're on one of those, you're fine, but from EVGA's perspective, their strategy is to get out from under this by putting out a new card with a new name, so it's not going to bring up all this controversy from a few months ago. So that's the reasoning for launching ICX now. The next thing is, if you own an ACX card, you could trade it in with a $100 bill in the envelope and get an ICX card. Is it worth it? Well, not really. The only main reason to do that is if you want new toys to play with, because again, if you have an ACX card and you've done the thermal pad mod, which is free for most countries anyway, it's fine. The temperatures are operating just fine. The only reason you'd really need to do the trade-in would be for resale value. because that will probably go up on the ICX cards. The ACX ones are again tainted by that image, even though it is largely a non-issue at this point, as we've stated in a very detailed long video. But resale is really the main reason to upgrade, because clock rate's the same, FPS is basically going to be the same. Temperatures, yes, are really improved in a lot of places on the board. Not all of them, but everywhere that we would like to see the improvement, EVGA has improved temperatures. But that's not necessarily the reason to upgrade a card, not for $100 anyway. If you're a new buyer though, and you don't own an ACX, this should absolutely be on your radar. ICX has made excellently informed engineering decisions, and from a testing standpoint, these cards are going to be much easier to work with. From an enthusiast standpoint, you have a lot more sliders and toys to play with, which is always a cool thing. Folks who don't yet own the 10 series cards should be seriously considering ICX, and that's really mainly for the finer tune control over temperature and noise. And these things are exceptionally rare these days. Generally, for a heatsink, for a video card, which is all these are, heat sinks and coolers, you don't see much improvement. The innovation is in different fin design, and this has gone a bit further than that. So we hope EVGA licenses its patents that are relevant to this to other vendors so they can begin adding thermistors to critical non-GPU components as well. For another point, if you were curious about EVGA's thermistor accuracy, we validated them with our own thermocouples by being basically adjacent, and the thermistors are perfectly precise from one test to the next, showing almost no variance under controlled conditions. It's a good thing. That means you can run the test and trust the numbers, which was the first question we had. We also found EVGA's temperatures to closely match our own thermocouple temperatures, despite being placed technically off the package from the components they're measuring. At another point still, EVGA has added a 10 amp fuse to the ICX cards that will blow before any major power issues occur, so the chance of this happening should really be infinitesimally small to begin with, but you'll now have a fuse protecting the rest of your computer in the event something does go wrong. That alone is a major critical move, and hopefully other vendors adopt this if they haven't already. So with a $30 price difference, value is good for folks who don't yet own a video card of this class, but again, we'd say skip it if you're on ACX with the thermal pad mod. And if you don't have ACX or anything else, skip ACX and get ICX. And a final reminder again, FPS performance is the same. So look up FTW or SC for more benchmarks on that. We've tested both of them. Pascal still has a hard stop around 2100 megahertz or thereabouts, so you're not going to get much more overclocking out of the new cards either, despite having a different VRM. Overall, job well done by EVGA with this improvement and iteration. The $100 upgrade is a nice way to try and help people who might feel burned by their previous purchase, but it's not necessary either for you to actually upgrade. So the fuse, the cooling apparatus, the thermistors, all good additions. Hopefully these get carried onward into new cards. If you like this coverage, as always, patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or click the link in the post-roll video. Link in the description below for the full review with a lot more depth. And if you want a different perspective on the EVGA ICX coolers, you can check out our friends Paul, Kyle, and Jay, who are all at the event with us. We'll link them in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.